Meeting over to Ms. Sarah Brunell. Ma'am, you may begin.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the National Cancer Institute, I wish to welcome everyone to the February Advanced Topics Implementation Science webinar. Today we are so very delighted to welcome our presenter, Laura Damschroeder, with the VA Center for Clinical Management Improvement in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She will be joined by our own David Chambers, who will be moderating the session. A very brief word about logistics, and we'll be off. As the operator said, questions are encouraged, and there are two ways you can ask your questions at the end of the session. You can press *1 to ask your question on the phone live. You'll be placed into the queue to do so. Or you can type your question in at the Q&A tab on the top of your screen and hit Ask to submit the question. You can submit your question at any time, but we will be opening the session for questions when all the speakers have finished. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the meeting over to Dr. David Chambers.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome to another Advanced Topics webinar. We are very excited to have Laura kick off what we see as a couple of different opportunities to really delve much deeper than we've been able to previously in the dissemination and implementation research frameworks that are being used by folks within the field. Some of you may recall from last month we had a couple of presenters who are going through a review of multiple models that have been used and organizing them, categorizing them across different criteria. But what we really wanted to do, starting with Laura, was to delve much more deeply into the individual frameworks that really have become omnipresent in a lot of the dissemination and implementation research studies that we're seeing. So this is not only a chance to learn about the framework, but to hear from Laura and the work that her team has done within the VA of using that framework, talking about in the context of particular projects, and really giving us a sense of not just a framework that's sitting sort of on a shelf on its own, but tangibly thinking about how do we link the concepts within the framework to measurement and to a whole range of tools that might make it easier for us to study dissemination and implementation, as well as to provide resources to folks in the field on the practice side who are trying to engage in dissemination and implementation research efforts. We're so very grateful to have Laura's insight and expertise on full display here. And so going to turn it over to Laura. We will encourage you, as Sarah had said, to join the discussion to ask the questions, and you got the instructions on how. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Laura, and again, thank her for taking the time out of her very busy schedule.
So thank you for the opportunity to talk about the wonderful work, really, that we've been able to do, that we've had the privilege to do within the VA. And none of this work would have been possible without the support of the query program within the VA and the diabetes query that's located in Ann Arbor, Michigan in particular. So I'm going to talk about the use of theory, or more specifically, the use of frameworks in implementation research. And as Dr. Chambers said, that I'm going to try to really bring this alive, that this isn't just a section in your proposal to kind of check a box about, yep, I use theory, but really making a case or really advocating for how theory can really help us move forward, both as researchers and then also for practitioners as well. So an outline of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about what I see as dual goals for implementation researchers, the power of theory. I will present a quick overview of a case study where we applied the CFIR, and then how this framework can be used to build the knowledge base collectively for implementation science, and then suggest a roadmap for moving the science of implementation forward. So dual goals for implementation research, and I would say that there are two major goals. One is, of course, to advance the science of implementation, and to do this through collaboration and by using a systematic approach to knowledge building as researchers, as scientists. The second major goal is really related to praxis, or the practice of implementation. That as implementation researchers, we really need to have a foot in both the scientific world and in, quote unquote, the real world of usually within hospitals, clinics, and communities, and really find ways to do our work, conduct our science in a way that contributes to a culture of learning healthcare systems. And I think that we as implementation researchers are really positioned well to be able to contribute in this way. So the power of theory. First of all, using a framework, even a loosely specified framework of constructs like the CFIR, which is what I'm going to talk about today, is really helpful for organizing how you collect data, how you analyze data, how you interpret it and present it, and it contributes toward helping build the scientific knowledge base. The more specified the models are in terms of interrelationships and hypothesized effects on implementation, moves us ever closer to really being able to gain the knowledge that we're seeking about context, about mechanisms of action, being able to generalize through theory, which is particularly important in implementation because we are often having to really randomize or test different implementation interventions at the organization level, not at the individual level. So our sample sizes are not as large. It's much more difficult, and therefore I think it's much more important, even more important for us to be able to synthesize and to grow knowledge across studies and settings, across groups of researchers. It provides a common set of terms and definitions, and all of these together really, I would argue, create an efficient way to systematically build collective knowledge about implementation. So there are a lot of models, frameworks, and theories, and from the presentations, the earlier advanced topics presentations, Rachel Tabak, for example, identified, I think it was 62 different frameworks related to dissemination and implementation. Certainly when we went to the literature back in 2009, which seems very not long ago at all, and yet so many more models and frameworks have been proliferated even since then. And at that time, what we wanted to do was create a framework that had constructs or concepts, influences on implementation all in one place. And thus the CFIR was born. And just very quickly, since 2009, we've had almost 400 citations of the CFIR original 2009 paper since it's been published. And it's growing as the years go on or over time. And then the types of research, most of them are what we call incidental references, like context is important, and then they'll refer to the CFIR paper. But there are an increasing number of studies that are using the CFIR and building it into empirical research, as well as guiding syntheses. So a framework like the CFIR, and this is really one of the first gaps that I want to talk about in terms of the need to build knowledge about barriers and facilitators. In other words, why will an intervention work or will it not work within a particular setting? We may have a particular hypothesized model as to why a particular intervention may work within a context, or an implementation strategy may work within a particular construct, but then we also need to understand the moderators of the effect of that implementation strategy. And so the CFIR, what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of using a case study of on the MOVE Weight Management Program within the VA. And this is a paper that was published with my colleague Julie Lowry in 2013. And in this paper, we go into quite a bit of detail about the methods that I'm going to that were used to create the results that I'm going to present today. So there's a lot more detail in this paper. But just in a snapshot, we really delved into 5 different facilities. I'm actually going to show findings from 4 facilities that were, the MOVE program was disseminated in VA nationwide. But a year and a half after that dissemination, there was wide variability in the workload that was being reported by those programs. And we actually used that as an indicator of the robustness or the effectiveness of the implementation of the MOVE program. And so these this graph just shows basically how there is a wide variation in the number or the rates of enrollment into the MOVE program at the time that we did this study. So getting to the framework, just a quick overview. It is a comprehensive framework. We designed it to be a comprehensive framework to promote consistent use of constructs, terminologies, and definitions of 39 constructs across 5 domains. We also wanted this to be a practical framework that we could apply in doing implementation work. So the first domain are intervention characteristics that may take on different sizes and shapes and have a different degree of fit, so to speak, with the context into which it's being implemented. The next domain, or another one of the 5 domains within the CFIR, are the individuals that are involved, both the individuals that were wanting to use the new innovation that's being implemented, and also the individuals that are involved in doing the implementation itself. Another domain is the inner setting. So the inner setting refers to culture, for example, the social architecture of the setting within which you're implementing, the leadership and their degree of engagement with and support with the implementation process. Communications across professional and organizational boundaries. Those are just some examples of influences within the inner setting that affect implementation. Another domain is the outer setting. So there may be payment regulations or payment rules that have a huge effect on our ability to be able to implement innovations. And that's just one example of a construct within the outer setting. And then finally, we have the process of implementation itself. And the CFIR really kind of takes a very high-level view. It is not a prescriptive framework. It is an explanatory framework, meaning that even in the process domain, what we're saying is that across all of the prescriptive approaches for doing and conducting implementation, there are 4 major kind of constructs or ways of doing implementation that are common across these approaches. And that is planning, engaging key stakeholders, executing to the plan and doing it incrementally, ideally, and reflecting and evaluating. And it really kind of reflects the plan, do, study, act cyclical approach to implementation for those of you that are familiar with that approach. And we have a website, a technical assistance website at cfirguide.org, and this is just a screenshot of the home page. And we've got, or actually it's of our wiki, to get you over into the wiki. We have a list of all of the constructs on the website, and it will take you to a wiki that will give you a full description of each of the constructs and also links into any quantitative measures that we know about, and then also guidance for qualitative coding. There are some coding guidelines for the constructs. And one of the tools that I just want to highlight on this website is the ability to create an interview guide based on that is guided by the CFIR. And so if you were to select the construct that you want to include in your interviews and then check off, you can check off open-ended questions that we suggest. And these questions were taken from actual studies. There have been several studies that have used the CFIR, and we took a look at all of those interview guides and then just basically came up with a list of questions for each of the constructs. So you can check off which questions are closest to what you're interested in, and do that for each of the constructs, and then create an interview guide that you can then cut and paste into a Word document and easily edit that and rearrange as needed for your own interview guide. So then quantitative measures, what I'm going to present to you today or talk about in our case study is relies on qualitative data. But there are quantitative, actually there's not a set of published quantitative measures for the CFIR. But I know that there are several research groups that are in the process of developing them. For example, at the D&I conference in December, There were a couple of presentations about a research group out of Emory who were developing a comprehensive set of CFIR measures. And then on our website, we also are working to map other existing organizational measures that are related to implementation. For example, the ORCA, the Organizational Readiness to Change Assessment Tool, and we've mapped each of the items in that tool to CFIR constructs, so that might be useful as well. So getting back to the case study, looking at the MOVE program, we have a method or an approach that's documented in our published 2013 paper that where we apply ratings that indicate the extent to which that particular construct influences implementation, either strongly or weakly, or negatively or positively. So for example, with the construct networks and communications, this is about how people communicate across organizational boundaries and also working relationships. You can see here that the low implementation sites had strong negative influence. There was a real absence of networks and communication characteristics in the low implementation sites. But in the higher implementation sites, there was a strong positive influence. And I just highlight this because it's just a real clear example of how this construct distinguishes between high and low implementation sites. Then if we were to look at goals and feedback, which is another construct within the inner setting, that also is a construct that distinguished between high and low implementation facilities. And so if we delve into this a little bit more, looking at goals and feedback, the issue and the barrier that we observed from our interviews through our qualitative data is that really at all of the sites, but especially at the lowest implementation sites, people were not able to track outcomes, program outcomes over time. They didn't have access to the data, or they really felt uncomfortable in how to use the data. So what are some change techniques that might be used as part of an implementation strategy to help improve the effectiveness of implementation? And so I just have a few listed here. Some of them are from published lists of implementation strategies that are evidence-based, and some are anecdotal. For example, from our empirical work analyzing the qualitative data in this case study, we found that people's use of anecdotal success stories of patients really helped bring data alive for leaders and got them more engaged in the program. So that's an example of how strategies then can be mapped to knowledge about where the gaps are in a particular setting. So in terms of building the knowledge base, what I've presented to this point is how a framework can be useful within an individual study. But where the real power of the framework, of using a framework like this, like the CFIR, comes in, is in more efficient synthesis across studies. There are more and more papers, more and more researchers are recognizing the lack of information. If you look at Cochrane reviews of multi-component behavioral interventions like audit and feedback, for example, which is a great strategy to use in many implementation efforts, when they do a review about the effectiveness of audit and feedback, in the conclusion, there are usually words, something to the effect of, we need to understand more about the context in which audit and feedback, or whatever the intervention is, occurred, so that we can better understand the mixed effects that we're seeing across studies. So in our center, we have had, well, actually this slide shows 3 studies that were all related to lifestyle change. So I've already talked about the MOVE program, and then there was the TeleMove program, and there was another telephone-based coaching program. And these were 3 evaluations that all used the CFIR. They're all related to lifestyle change, but they're different interventions. They use technologies in different ways, or they don't use technology at all. And the key here is to see how when you start synthesizing over multiple studies, that now these very small studies that had a dozen or fewer units of analysis or medical centers, now across the 3 studies, we've got 22 medical centers based on 155 interviews. And then what we can do is look at, within each of the studies, kind of compare and contrast the findings across the 3 studies. And the dark orange cells in this table show when the construct is a strongly distinguishing construct between high and low implementation sites within each particular study. So for example, with networks and communications, again, one of my favorite constructs, all the MOVE, telemove, and TLC, all 3 programs, this construct was a distinguishing factor between high and low. So we can say, at least qualitatively, that it appears to be associated with successful implementation or with implementation outcomes. But then other constructs are important for some types of interventions, like maybe 2 of the 3 programs that were being implemented, but not in the 3rd. And so this begins to give us insights about which constructs matter based on the type of program being implemented. So then moving on, we actually have a total of 6 studies that have used the CFIR, and we're beginning now to get enough of a sample size that allows us to do qualitative comparative analysis, which is a more sophisticated approach and to analyzing quantified qualitative data. And the great thing about this approach, using QCA methods, is that it allows us to identify combinations of constructs that lead to success or failed implementation. So for example, and I'm not going to dwell on the particular findings, but the point here is that 3 of the studies were related to specialty care initiatives, and 3 of the programs were related to telehealth or to lifestyle change. And now we have a total of 44 different units of analysis going across these 2 clusters of programs, or 2 types of programs. And the key here is to notice that, for example, the combination of leadership, networks and communications, and adaptability is a recipe, so to speak, for successful implementation. And that there are different combinations of constructs, again, depending on the type of intervention or the type of program that is being implemented. So what I've talked about to this point is the gaps and really how we can move forward to identifying and understanding at a much more sophisticated level barriers and facilitators, or in other words, moderators, to implementation success, and really helping explain why a particular intervention or implementation strategy either did work as an explanation, or that it will work, or at least to increase the chances for success of implementation. The next area that I just want to propose as part of the roadmap for moving forward in science of implementation is related to the targeted innovation. And by that, I mean the clinical intervention that is being implemented. So for example, the weight management program that I talked about in the case study. And in this case, we all too often don't know what the active ingredients are in these multi-component interventions. And this information does not come out of the randomized control trial published articles. And in addition to not really knowing which of, let's say there are 6 components to a targeted innovation, well, maybe only 3 of those are really necessary to achieve the benefits comparable to that we're seeing in a randomized controlled trial. That gives us information about how the intervention or the innovation can be adapted then to context. And furthermore, we really need to understand how to adapt even those remaining 3 active essential components in a way that does not undermine benefits for patients. Often patients are who we're seeking to improve health and well-being for. And this is a slide just showing two different other frameworks that help us describe behavior change, specifically behavior change intervention. So these are more targeted toward the innovation being implemented. And then the next gap really that we need to address within implementation science is how do we conduct implementation? So it's really the mechanism of implementation. And these are models or frameworks that are more prescriptions of, step 1, 2, 3, for example, the getting to outcomes framework for how to conduct implementation. And then we also need to understand how to tailor strategies in a way that will help to improve the likelihood of successful implementation. So I mentioned earlier, actually just in passing, that this slide just shows 3 example sources of implementation strategies. So for example, the EPOC systematic reviews provide evidence-based implementation strategies, as does the McMaster's repository. There was a paper just published in Implementation Science that extended upon Byron Powell's earlier work with a list of 72 different implementation strategies that really draw off of the EPOC and other sources. And then I want to go back to the CFIRguide.org, the technical assistance website, because we have some ideas here for how to move forward in understanding and also create tools for practitioners and researchers about how to tailor implementation strategies. So one example that we have a mock-up of is imagine like the interview guide, except for instead of choosing questions for an interview guide, you choose implementation techniques that you can then bundle together into a tailored strategy. And so you would select your domain that you're interested in addressing, select a construct within that domain. You can click to find out more about how to use that strategy, what the evidence base is for it, and then check the boxes off for the techniques that you want to try to address the particular gaps that are indicated by your assessment of the constructs using the CFIR, let's say. And then click to create a tailored implementation strategy. And it might look something like this. And so the idea is to create a tool to help people create and execute a tailored strategy for their particular setting. And it's really the confluence of all of these, understanding context, understanding how the targeted innovation works within that context, and the process of implementation. All of those together really are what are needed to contribute to maximizing program benefits ultimately for patients or other individuals. So in summary, a roadmap for the future and using frameworks and how frameworks can help us do this for science is that frameworks provide a foundation of common terminology and constructs, and eventually to specify hypothesized models or testable models. We need to be able to assess context in a useful and predictive way, both quantitatively, qualitatively. A lot of qualitative work is being done. Quantitative measures are being developed, but we really don't have a good set of quantitative measures that are predictive of implementation. We need to understand targeted innovations better and be more explicit about how we describe those innovations and how they can be adapted to maximize benefits for the beneficiaries. And then we need to understand implementation strategies and how to tailor them, and ultimately to generate testable theories. And then moving forward in terms of kind of packaging all of this scientific knowledge for the real world, is really to provide guidance for practitioners to plan successful implementation. And this would include tools like being able to assess your own context, and then how to choose and execute implementation strategies that are tailored to your particular setting. And that I believe that if we've got a good, robust architecture and really that rests on a foundation of a set of frameworks, that we can have learning repositories that help us collectively learn over time, both practitioners and researchers. And in this way, we can really understand what works where and why. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Now we'll open it up for questions. Just a reminder, there are two ways that you can submit questions. You can press *1 to ask your question on the phone, or you can use the Q&A feature at the top of your screen. For those of you on live meeting, just type your question to the provided field and hit ask.
Okay, yeah, and echoing Sarah's thanks to Laura. While we're waiting for folks to chime in, Laura, I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more as you know, there's clearly been so much work done with the CFIR to try and operationalize and then link to link to different measures. Do you feel like, and since this may be an audience that is often thinking about measurement development, do you feel like there might be areas of measurement that are less well developed that might be good to enhance or potentially might lead to measurement development projects?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many challenges with measurement. So one is, what do we measure? And I don't think we have a good feel for what to measure. I think that we've hypothesized, concepts like readiness for change, for example, and it may or may not be predictive of implementation success. And part of the problem that we have with measurement and using it as a predictive tool is that things change. We're working in a very dynamic environment. Maybe a key program champion leaves after you've measured a very positive context for implementation. And that can, kind of blow and stop the process in its tracks and end up with a failed implementation, even though at baseline we may have predicted success for that particular site. So that's just an example of how kind of the dynamic nature of this implementation process that we're trying to get our arms around really, that's a huge challenge for measurement. And then just fundamentally conceptualizing the inner setting, I think in particular, is the single most complex domain, and then how interactions between individuals and kind of the collective organization interact. So how do, for example, individual knowledge and beliefs or self-efficacy interact with, or motivation, interact with more collective measures of communication across organizational boundaries or resource availability. So there are really kind of interesting conceptual questions to answer in the measurement. I don't think we can take a traditional, let's go out and talk to stakeholders, generate items, and do psychometric assessment necessarily. That's very essential. Actually, I don't want to devalue that. I think it's still very important as a way of developing crisp, reliable measures. But we still don't really also have a good understanding, even of well-validated measures, of do we focus on averages, means, or is there as much or more information perhaps contained in the variation or the patterns in responses? What does the sample size need to look like? Is one person adequate to represent an organization? Do we need 3 people? What kinds of people? 12, 50? So there are a lot of questions within the measurement, other than just developing the measures themselves. I hope I've made this interesting and not depressing.
No. Well, I think what it speaks to me and hopefully to the folks on who are listening in is to the multiple things that we can really think about doing to enhance our understanding of the application of these different frameworks, the development, but also I think, as you're saying, the use even of the measures that have been developed and validated might not be as simplistic as we sometimes like to make it. So I think those are great points. I do see that there is a question that has been posted. You mentioned, and more coming. Great. Keep them coming. So you mentioned the use of a standardized coding scheme. To what extent does this accommodate a range of conceptual approaches to and methods for data collection?
I mentioned, so you're talking about, the question is about a coding scheme. So first of all, about coding specifically, we take a kind of a team-based approach to coding. For those of you who are familiar with qualitative analysis, the CFIR constructs, especially when you're not very familiar with them and you're using them for the first time, we actually, first of all, we translate the CFIR framework into a code book. And actually, for people using NVivo, we have an NVivo project template on the website that has the CFIR coded into the template as qualitative codes. But these codes are pretty highly interpretive, which means that it is not easy to apply these codes. That's the easiest way to put it. And it takes a lot of kind of self-training or talking to other people who have used the CFIR, and really being careful about and strategic about how you operationalize for your particular data. If by coding you're talking about applying the ratings to the qualitative data, and I guess stepping back, well, okay, so we code the data using the constructs like themes or like qualitative codes. And then for each of the codes, in each of the interviews, we assign the numbers, the ratings, going from -2 to a +2 and including 0 and mixed. And we take kind of a coding approach to that as well. And so we have a consensus approach. We have multiple raters. And then we, look for agreement. We have consensus if there's disagreement, discussions about what the final rating should be. And then build up from those individual interviews so that you have ratings at the site level across all of the interviews. We do not do arithmetic averages because some people are much better informed about, what is really happening versus other interviewees. And so you really have to weight what the contributions of each of the interviewees. And this is a qualitative, maybe perhaps somewhat subjective process, but we build in, approaches to help make it robust, less susceptible to bias. This general approach can be applied regardless of the framework you use. So if you're using normalization process theory, Anne McFarland, I think her first name, or McFarland, published an article, for example, very detailed about how going through and using normalization process theory as kind of creating a code book and validating that from a qualitative analysis perspective. So I think these same principles can be used regardless of the framework.
Great, thanks for that, and thanks to Suzanne Hurton-Roberts for the question. We have, I see, another question coming from Greg Ahrens. Much of the work that uses different measures are in more observational studies. These are passive tests of implementation constructs. In contrast, there are fewer studies that are testing strategies to improve specific issues. Can you comment on the degree to which only using results of observational study of implementation process versus active strategies to improve constructs like climate, culture, and leadership may underestimate the impact of different factors?
Yeah, there are all kinds of issues with, really putting our hats on results from these relatively small-scale studies and making conclusions or overly strong conclusions, I guess, about which constructs are strong influencers and which ones are not. So first of all, as kind of a precursor answer to your question, the constructs that are, what is becoming very clear to me and or has come out to me in doing multiple, more observational naturalistic studies is that there are underlying kind of shared conditions within a particular study. So for example, we did an analysis of a telephone coaching program for the VA. And we had, 12 sites, but they all had very strong centralized support. They all had excellent, materials and communication tools for their providers and for their patients. I mean, just really high quality stuff. So we can't test, like, the impact of or the influence of packaging. We can't test the influence of maybe communication strategies because it's constant across all of the facilities, or the evidence base because they all believed that this particular program did have a strong evidence base. So we can't really make conclusions from that. So that's one problem, is the lack of diversity within a particular study, and that's why I think it's important to have these kind of learning repositories or be able to synthesize across different settings. But then your question was about, the passive versus really kind of the proactive or prospective study design. And we really need to move into these prospective study designs. My dream is that, we have these learning repositories, and we've got so many moving pieces that we can't control them all within one single study. I mean, that's a real problem in establishing like a clear causal pathway. But if we're able to kind of learn across, many diverse studies and be able to discern, do big data analysis, and I don't know what it would be, but to be able to discern these kind of pathways of change so that if there's, a gap, like in goals and feedback, for example, and then we do audit and feedback in this particular way, that there is some level of success, however that may be measured. And of course, it's fraught with all kinds of challenges in every dimension. But I do agree with that comment.
Right.
A long way of saying that.
No, very, very helpful. I see we have another question from Kimberly van Heetsma. Apologies for any mispronunciation. That is mine alone. Can the CFIR framework be used as a framework for intervention development? In other words, can components of the CFIR framework point to constructs that interventions must address to ensure a feasible and effective intervention?
So I have been thinking about the kind of the intervention mapping approach that has been developed by researchers at Emory and elsewhere in Texas. And I believe the answer is yes. And I'm focused more on implementation strategies versus clinical interventions. And there's a lot in the literature about intervention mapping for clinical interventions and the extent to which there is a kind of presumed underlying framework that explains why you think that intervention is going to work. So the CFIR, so leaving that to the side, the CFIR, when I talk about tailored implementation strategies, that really is kind of a strategy that is mapped to an assessment of context using the CFIR. So that essentially is what I'm describing. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, and certainly there's been a lot spoken about in terms of designing for dissemination. And if we think about some of these frameworks as, I think as the questioner suggests, as domains that we ought to be developing our interventions around, then I think there is an assumption that we may, at the point when we determine that they're effective, there may be an easier pathway to have them integrated. Certainly the packaging of different interventions may speak a lot to whether they can be adopted, and certainly to the degree that they can be implemented and sustained over time. There's another question here. Given the guidance that you've incorporated into the talk around tailoring, is there an opportunity to use the CFIR as a front end of a testing of the impact of adaptation on outcomes?
So you're talking about, I'm going to assume that you're talking about adapting the clinical intervention that is being implemented.
Right.
And there's a CFIR construct called compatibility, which is concerned with, and also there's another, okay, so there are two constructs related to this question. One is stakeholders' perception of the adaptability of the clinical intervention for their particular setting. And the CFIR and there are studies that either have shown or hypothesized that the intervention needs to be adaptable within the particular setting. There's another construct that is important to pay attention to, and that is compatibility. And that's within the a construct within the inner setting. And it's really about the compatibility of the intervention with existing clinical processes, workflow, and then also with the values of the professionals or the stakeholders that are going to be using that clinical intervention. An example of kind of a recent example of a recent study that we've been consulting with is the use of telemental health interventions and doing therapy, psychotherapy over long distance. And there are many professionals within the mental health sphere that do not believe that that is inappropriate, that using that technology in that way for psychotherapy is not appropriate. So that would be an example of an intervention that is going crossways with the values or the beliefs of clinicians. And then there are obvious examples, too many examples of how clinical interventions fail to fit or adapt to clinical workflows. So how the CFIR is used to guide that necessarily, I think that that adapting the particular intervention is more a function of the characteristics of the specific intervention. So like whether it's a behavior change intervention, whether it's a decision aid, whether it's a, each of the clinical interventions has their own specific needs in terms of specific adaptations. Shannon Wiltsey-Sturman has published a framework that talks about some of the features of adaptation that should be considered and described so that in publications we can understand how the intervention was adapted. I think that a framework like this could also be used prospectively to help guide our thinking about what to consider in the ways that the intervention should be adapted.
Great, thanks. Before entertaining the next written question, just want to ask the operator or encourage if folks want to speak the question, feel free to let us know. Operators, is there anyone who's standing by? You have to dial *1, I think it is.
Yes, it is *1, and no, there are no questions holding on the phone line.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Okay, so the next written question is, I think, related to that, and certainly with the CFIR laying out this notion of core components of interventions and an adaptable periphery. I guess a question about the interventions that have been used with CFIR. How clear are they in terms of what are considered core components and what's the sort of adaptable periphery?
That is a gap in our knowledge, definitely. And that's the, let's see, I'm going to go back to this, one of these roadmap slides here. So if you look at, actually I'm going to go back farther than that. Hang on. So that's what I was talking about with our lack of knowledge about what the active ingredients are. The active ingredients really coincide are another term for the core components or the irreducible components that are necessary to achieve the benefits that we expect from that particular intervention. And the fact is that the reporting is poor on that for all kinds of reasons. We just don't have the venues to be able to, well, first of all, it's hard to tease apart which are the components that are active. And then even if, as a trialist, you do have, maybe some hypotheses about which components contributed to the observed benefits or the reported benefits, we really don't have the venues to report that in any great detail. So I think that is really an important gap to address. And I also want to make a case or advocate use of hybrid trials. The paper written by Jeff Curran in Medical Care that talks about effectiveness implementation hybrid trials, so that trialists much more frequently, if not always, incorporate at least a process evaluation that includes some kind of at least a qualitative assessment of what the core components are versus the adaptable periphery.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And at this point, we do want to say thank you. And even though people are muted, I'm sure there is a rousing ovation that we just can't hear right now. But we're very appreciative, Laura, for you taking the time and really sharing your wisdom, and also, I think, identifying what some next steps that we should all be thinking about should be for the future. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for participating. I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah, and we'll look forward to connecting with you all again soon.
Thank you so much. I just want to point out that your feedback is important to us, and we encourage you to complete our online evaluation. A link to that survey will be sent to you in an email shortly. Finally, as mentioned, we'd like to continue this discussion from the webinar online at researchtoreality.cancer.gov, where you can engage with Laura and David and other participants through discussion forums and posts. Thank you again for joining us for this month's webinar, and we hope to see you at next month's webinar on the EPIS, the Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment Multi-Level Implementation Framework, registration for which will be opening soon.